All right, we are live with the Happy Whole You podcast. And Dr. Robert Melillo, I'm so glad you're here. And for everyone that's about to watch and listen to this amazing interview, note that episode 205 of the Happy Whole You podcast, Dr. Melillo was on there and we really focused on autism and had a very deep conversation around that and brain development. And today we're going to dive into ADHD. But before we get into that, I want to welcome you and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be back. I think we had a lot more to talk about.
Yes, absolutely. And before we dive in, can you just give everyone the 411 on who you are, what you're passionate about, and essentially how you're changing the world?
Yeah, I'm really passionate about neuroscience, brain development, and how to translate that into cutting edge treatment for any sort of neurodevelopmental issue, which really includes most mental health issues, even in adults. We know that almost all adult mental health issues start in childhood. And so my passion has been really understanding the brain and understanding what are the root causes and how do we change that in a way. Not try to change the person because the people are usually amazing, but how do we enhance their strengths and minimize their weaknesses, which we all have, and just create balance in their brain so that they can function at the optimal version of them.
Yes, I love that. And if we think about from an evolutionary standpoint, you've been studying the brain and working with people, I think, for 40 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, for 40 plus years. Yes, yeah.
So, what do you think is going on with our brains that wasn't happening 40 years ago? Because, to my knowledge, and maybe you found differently, there's no gene that causes autism, no gene that causes ADHD. What is going on? Because the rates of diagnosis and medications have just skyrocketed.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's really great that you did it said from an evolutionary perspective. So my first textbook was called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood from an evolutionary perspective. And we're actually going to be doing a second edition of that after 20 years. It came out in 2004. And in that, one of the first questions we wanted to talk about was where did brains come from on the planet? Like, why did a brain evolve, right? And it really turns out that it did evolve because of movement. Living things that don't move don't have brains. Living things that move have a brain for the most part. And we know that if you translate that into human brain development, we know that our brain development is unique, but that it has evolutionary history. And so we know that the development of early brains is driven by movement. That's the foundation of brain development. And the foundation of that is what we call retained primitive reflexes. So if I was to ask you over the past 30 years, let's say, right, as we've seen this explosive growth, what would you say would have been the biggest change in society that you have personally witnessed or experienced over the past 30 years?
Definitely, we're moving less, sitting more, and the foods that we're putting in our bodies and the toxicity that is around us with chemicals, plastics, things like that that have evolved over time.
And what do you think is driving that lack of movement?
Technology, convenience, really just all of the amazing things that people have invented to make life easier, to put forth effort with a greater output.
Yeah, so it really all started with the personal computer, right?
Yeah.
And so when did that start? That started in 1980, basically. We're looking at 40 plus years. It took a while before that really made its way into our households. And then the expansion of that into iPhones and iPads and all the other technology. And now AI is accelerating all of that. So the biggest difference, without a doubt, in the past 30 years, 40 years, has been the level of physical movement that humans do, and especially at earlier and earlier ages, so that we see that this has been impacting. So, again, with the context that movement is what drives brain development, and that almost all of these issues like autism, ADHD, OCD, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, bipolar are all developmental. What we're seeing is what is the one thing that has the biggest impact on development? It's movement. And brain development, part of that is what we see is that is impacting the maturity and the development of the autonomic system. So the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic, which is what allows us to digest foods, break down foods, that allows us to absorb nutrients, which allows us to detoxify any chemicals or thing that are coming in our body, and is also part of allowing us to sleep and rest and all of those things. And that ultimately is also what drives the balance in the immune system of inflammation versus anti-inflammation. And we just have a big paper that's coming out on that, on basically the way the brain regulates inflammation and anti-inflammation through the central nervous system and through the sympathetic and parasympathetic balance. So that's why I believe that the foundation of all of this started with the development of technology, which one, it's also emphasizing left brain growth and development. So as we've gone through technological advances, really with the development of Western civilization, with the development of education and reading and books and literature and science and everything over the years has been more and more driving left brain development. And now with technology, it drives it even more. And then we combine that with lack of movement that's increasing at younger and younger ages, and then the impact that has on the development of our digestive system and our immune system. And this is what is causing this epidemic rise of all of these neurodevelopmental issues. And it was just research that just came out about a few weeks ago showing that it was always told that the brain is still developing till 25. The study only went up to 25.
Okay.
Yeah, the most recent studies show that the brain is probably developing at least until we're 35.
Oh, man.
That means brain developmental issues may not show up until at least the 30s. So that when you see someone that develops schizophrenia in their 20s, it starts in childhood. And so it doesn't show up because the level of imbalance, the developmental degree of imbalance doesn't fully kick in until the 20s. Bipolar may not kick in till the 30s, but we know it all starts in childhood.
Okay, so much great stuff said there. Makes sense to me. But for somebody listening, if they're like, okay, what do you mean by the left brain is more dominant? What is the problem with that? So, what's going on when someone's left brain is on or the right brain is not to where the left brain is? I know the right brain isn't necessarily off, but what is going on there and why does that happen?
Yeah, great question. One is when we look at autism or ADHD or OCD and other things like schizophrenia, we know that really the root of it is that their left brain networks are overactive and their right brain networks are underdeveloped. And so the right brain is really the social brain, the emotional brain, the ability to regulate emotions, the ability to really feel. Most of our emotions are really dependent on right brain. Attachment, any sort of attachment. So things like most attachment disorders have to do with a right brain delay or deficit. We know that our ability to build bonds and social relationships, to emotionally regulate ourselves, to see the big picture. The right brain is more naturalistic. It's more based in reality. We want to be outside. We want to be in nature. We want to talk to people. The right brain is what drives conversations between people. The right brain is more moralistic. Our sense of right or wrong is really more of a right brain type of thing. The right brain is more looking at the collective, like what's good for society, what's good as a whole. The right brain wants to get along with people. The right brain is wisdom. It's our ability to also look at things from a practical standpoint. What makes sense? What's common sense? The left brain is really more technology driven. It's more ego driven. It's more about ourselves. It's about our own goals, our own needs. It's more verbally driven. So it has more of a voice where the right brain really doesn't. But the left brain is not so much about emotions. It's not really interested that much in attachment or relationships. It's more about remembering data, collecting data, organizing that data, putting it into certain timelines and sequences so that we can set goals and we can pursue goals and we can use that as a tool. So when we look at where we're going as a society, the left brain, one of its primary emotions is anger. The right brain, one of its primary emotions is shame and guilt and sadness. So when we look at what's happening, like the rise of anxiety is in a large part driven a lot by right brain dominance, but it also can be the opposite. So what we see is as a society, we're more divided, we're more angry, the left brain drives more inflammation. It's overactive. It drives the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system. So it dampens our ability to really digest food well or absorb nutrients. And it keeps us in this kind of more anxious fight or flight state. So we see that being driven towards left brain is really where we see the rise of these issues where like autism, they're in unbelievably brilliant, even the ones that aren't speaking. We had talked about that. But yet they really struggle with socialization and emotional regulation and understanding the big picture and understanding context and not really being able to problem solve at the same level and not really feeling or connected to their body. They prefer to live in a virtual world of their own and they prefer to do things over and repeat things where the right brain is more the creative and the more it wants to be around people and it likes new things. So we can see that a lot of this is being driven in that way.
Okay, so much I want to ask. I'm hoping my brain can bring it all together. So, for one, I can't help but not think of my own brain as you're speaking. And when I look at where I've come from and how far I've come to work on my brain, I'm actually going to be doing a TED talk. And part of the story I'm going to share with you right now, I'm going to say in the TED talk, something that I realized is there was an event that happened when I was 6 years old. I was with my older brother at his friend's house, and I was happy to be there because I got to hang out with my older brother and felt so cool. And I remember we were standing in this doorway, and the dad had said that we're about to go do something else. And I was like, oh my gosh, I get to go. This is so cool. And then he looked at me and he said, you don't get to go. And I remember my physical body felt this feeling I'd never felt before. And then in the same sentence, he said, I'm just kidding. But that something with that moment, because I was meditating back, trying to figure out why have I spent the majority of my life up until the last couple years proving myself, certification after certification, trying to be better, all these things. I've achieved so much success. And then lately, I've been really trying to connect with other people, trying to develop more relationships. And I'm like, I realized I have gone so long without developing really deep relationships. And I did have a SPECT imaging scan by the Amen clinics. I know you're familiar with Dr. Amen's work, right? Yeah. And I scored a 1 out of 10 in social. This was 8 years ago, by the way. And I scored a 1 out of 10 in flexible thinking. 1 is the worst score you can get. And I think of myself as someone very flexible in thinking, but I'm very analytical. I'll read books on herbs and encyclopedias on different herbs and what they can do, but I'm not into all the stories until recently. And I'm 43, around 40 years old, I started to recognize this pattern and how it's not serving me. And I've really been putting myself out there socially and doing a lot of different things. And my brain is like, this isn't safe, and I'm like, "Of course it's safe." You know what but I am like, as you're saying this in real time, I'm like, "Oh, wow, my left brain is on fire. What's going on there?"
Yeah, again, the left brain, people that are very academic, people that are highly what we call intelligent, traditional IQ measurements measure more left brain intelligence. There aren't a lot of really good tests out there to look at right brain intelligence. And so there's a skew. And again, because we're biased towards education, we teach in a left brain way. Psychology is delivered with talk therapy, which is more of a left brain way. What we traditionally think of as smart and intelligent is mostly in terms of how people can speak and how they can articulate and how they can write. So if you've spent a lot of your life really trying to prove yourself and you have these goals and you've done it through education and academics, you've spent a lot of your life really working on your left brain. All of us, first of all, are either a little bit more right brain or left brain dominant. Some people, based on your genetic traits that come from your family, might bias you even more one way or the other. So let's say if your parents were both really incredible musicians, songwriters, you probably have a gift in that area and you probably have an exceptional, strong, some right brain networks. Not all of them, but some of them. And the more gifted you are, because the brain is always trying to achieve an equilibrium, it's always trying to, it operates with balance. We need to have balance between these networks. But by the nature of it, if you're gifted, and then if you lean into that gift, if you're very good in school and you're academic and you really lean into that and you push yourself in that and you really spend most of your time educating, getting degrees, reading books, now you're boosting that left brain even more. And what happens is when you do that, there's a certain point where you start to drop or inhibit the other side. And the earlier you do that, the more you inhibit growth and development and maturity in other networks. And the imbalance in those networks is where all of the mental health symptoms live. And what we're learning is where most of the body symptoms live in that imbalance in the networks. So what you're saying is that when you scored a 1 on socialization and also a 1 on flexibility, right there you're telling me you're a very left brain dominant person and your left brain is overactive and it's suppressing your right brain, which is mental flexibility and socialization are both right brain abilities.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is our school system is reinforcing left brain all the way. And when we're left brain, this can cause these imbalance and these mental health issues down the road. Okay. One thing you said was that the movement piece, and we in the beginning we talked about ADHD and we wanted to dive into that piece. With movement, lacking movement, but people it seems like people with ADHD wanna move a lot. What is going on there? What's going on with people that are showing up as more of an ADHD brain?
I think we had talked about this last time was one of the things I think that confuses a lot of people is just the labels themselves because they're not really descriptive of what's actually happening in the brain, right? They don't really translate that into what does that mean in my brain? I have an attention deficit, but I'm hyperactive. What does that mean? Just with ADHD, there are three different subtypes. And type 1 is the inattentive alone type. That tends to be more of a left brain deficit with an overactive right brain. And that really is a very different model from the hyperactive and the combined type, which is type 2 and type 3, which is really classically the individual that's hyperactive, impulsive, and also has poor attention. But the left and right brain have different attention. The left brain has very focused, narrow, hyper focused attention that's short term. The right brain is more what we call open and sustained attention. And what we see is, again, there's a balance there. So if we see someone that may have a type 1 ADHD is more the type of the right brain dominant person that is usually very creative, that is really paying attention really to everything all at once, that may also have be hyper aware of other people's emotions and almost be like an empath, and also struggle with anxiety and some fear. And they may also struggle academically. They may have trouble hyper focusing. They may have trouble reading and writing and spelling and doing math or memorizing facts or details, but they may be unbelievably gifted in athletics or interpersonal relationships or getting the big picture or other things like some aspects of physics and things like songwriting or painting or designing. And that's one type of ADHD, but that's completely opposite from the more classic type of ADHD, which is impulsive and hyperactive. So when you look at that, you say, okay, attention, sustained attention that you really need, that these most individuals really lack with ADHD, the true right brain deficit ADHD. They don't have sustained attention. They can hyper focus on certain things that they may like short term, like video games, or but for them to really have sustained attention in a classroom or for any length of time is really almost impossible. That's more of a right brain attention. Now, the left brain generates motor activity more. And there's an area of the brain called the premotor area of the frontal lobe that when it's overactive in the left side, it creates movement, unwanted movement, unregulated movement, where the right brain normally would inhibit that. So any sort of stimming behavior, tics, repetitive behavior, or hyperactivity, these are dopaminergic networks that are related to an area of the brain called the basal ganglia, and they're hyperactive. So, overactivity of the left brain networks makes us hyperactive or might lead to tics or stimming type behavior. And then that's combined with a deficit of the right brain, which is there's an area in the parietal lobe, which is what governs sustained attention. And that's classic ADHD.
So, what if someone's listening and they're thinking, I am more left brain or I am more right brain? What are some things that they can start doing to help balance that out?
I like what you said before because you said that you were concerned that your social score was lower and maybe your mental flexibility. So what did you do? You did that, right? You leaned into your weakness.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Traditionally, in education, in behavioral medicine, what has been the tradition is let's lean into the individual strengths, right? All right, a child struggles with this type of learning, but they're really good at this. Instead of understanding why is that, you usually say, okay, let's focus on their strengths and ignore their weaknesses so we don't make them feel bad. Okay, I understand that, but that from a neurological perspective, it's the exact wrong thing to do. I've always looked at what we need to do is we need to actually focus on the weakened areas or the underdeveloped areas and strengthen them. When we strengthen them, which means, and we have different things we're talking about, there is a dominant style in the way we think. But that doesn't mean we might have an imbalance. Someone can be relatively balanced, but be a little bit more right brain or a little bit more left brain, be highly functioning, maybe some of the most functional people on the planet, and they're not struggling. But we also can have an imbalance where we have too much of one side and it's inhibiting the other side. And then what we need to do, and this is a principle of any rehab, by the way, any sort of rehabilitation, it usually comes down to imbalances. In the body, it might come down to imbalances of muscles, or in the body, it might come into imbalances in vitamins or minerals or whatever. And we want to achieve balance. So, what we want to do is really lean into the weaknesses by identifying and recognizing that this is part of my brain and that my left brain does this really well and I'm really good at that and I tend to do that over and over, but if I do it too much, it makes me feel depressed or anxious, or I start to lose concentration, or I get angry more than I would like to, and not really understanding why. because the brain is very dynamic. Everything we do every day, and it's an advantage, but it's also a vulnerability. Trying to get people to understand their own brain, understand, are you more right brain or left brain dominant? If you have any struggles or things, where are they coming from? Are they coming because certain areas are overactive, or are certain areas underactive, or is it a combination of those? And then what can I do to focus on those weakened areas and make them stronger?
I had a question for you, and I think that you've probably answered it, but I think there's around like 15 million people diagnosed with ADHD or some crazy number like that. My question for you is, do you think that we are over medicated or that we're misunderstanding the brain? And just from hearing you talk, I'm like, I feel like we're misunderstanding the brain.
It's both.
Yeah.
The idea that what drives me crazy is when I hear people that, even people that are doctors or physicians or supposed experts, when they talk about a condition and they talk about it in terms as, "Well, there's nothing we can do about it. This is a lifelong condition that you only can accept. And the only answer is to medicate." All of that, whenever I hear that, it just tells me that who's ever saying that knows nothing about the brain. They have no idea. The brain is so dynamic and so adaptable. The whole concept of neuroplasticity, every year we know that it's more and more plastic and it's more and more changeable. And in almost any of those issues, we're never dealing in almost any case with pathology or a defect. The whole idea of chemical imbalances isn't real. And the idea that these are genetic mutations, they're not. So, in almost every situation, they are changeable if you understand the way the brain works, the way it's supposed to develop, and what we can do to change it in non-invasive ways, in safe ways, and support it nutritionally with diet and eliminate us from things that toxins or minimize those things in our body and our environment. And so medication as a short-term symptom management makes sense in some cases, especially when people are in crisis. But from a long term standpoint, it really doesn't make sense in most cases. The idea is, the analogy I use is, if you injured yourself, if you, let's say, you tore your cartilage in your knee and you needed to, and it was swollen and you couldn't move, and ultimately, you need to rehab your knee. That's the solution long term. But in the interim, you're in pain. So you need to take a pain medication, an anti inflammatory, maybe a steroid to reduce the swelling and the inflammation so that you can even do the rehab that will get you to the point where eventually you repair your knee, you strengthen it up, and you create balance. And then you don't have pain anymore and you don't have inflammation anymore. And then you don't need the medication anymore. If anything, I think that's also how we should be looking at medication and its use for developmental, but especially in children, because this is something that nobody really talks about, but that most of the medications that are used in kids have never been studied in kids. And virtually none of the medication that are used in combination have ever been studied in combination. If a kid is on especially more than two medications, that's never been studied ever. So we have no idea what the interaction may be. We have no idea what the effects are. And most of the medications are off label, meaning they've never been used, or you may be using a blood pressure medication for ADHD in children. And that was only tested for blood pressure in adults, blood pressure. But yet you're using it in children and you're saying that this is evidence based medicine. It isn't, because there's never been any studies done on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I actually just did for my community some free holistic health assessments for moms with children under 2 years old. For the mom, I struggled with postpartum depression after my first. And it was interesting because I had quite a few moms that they were put on an SSRI after giving birth, and they were told they would be on it for like 6 months, but they're still on it. And then their OBGYN has told them they need to go to a primary care to figure out how to get off the medication. And so my question to you is for women that have just had children or are going through with all these hormone changes, what's going on with their brain in terms of that period of their life?
Yeah. So when there are imbalances, again, as I said, people that are unusually gifted in an area may always have a little bit of an imbalance, meaning they're really super good at certain things, but they may struggle with other things in daily life. But it's not pathological. It doesn't really disrupt their life. Somebody, let's say, that's a great singer songwriter, that's incredible and amazing, but they may tend to be a little disorganized and maybe a little messy. And maybe they don't always do that. You might be a little late for their schedules, but that's okay. You're fine. Now you add massive changes in hormones or things that can shift inflammation, and that can tip that balance a little bit too much. And now it goes into full blown depression. And so the balance was there. Hormones, inflammation, chemicals in our body can shift that bias one way or the other and make it from where it may have not been overly symptomatic to where now it's really symptomatic. But then as the hormones go away, you would like to believe that might shift back, but it might not, and it might need help. So the point is that any sort of emotion like feeling depression, what is depression? Depression, there are networks in the left frontal lobe that generate networks for joy and happiness and pride, right? There are networks in the right side of the brain that generate the emotions of sadness and shame and embarrassment and guilt. The definition of major depressive disorder is basically lack of joy with an overactivity of sadness combined with shame and guilt. That's what it is. So that's where the depression is coming from. So now we have to look to the brain and then realize that hormones can definitely shift that. A lifestyle, what you're eating can shift it and make it worse. And that's why not every mom gets postpartum depression. And if we looked at the personality of that person, or if we looked at what was going on in their life, we might be able to screen them and say, who is susceptible? And can we start to balance their brain before they're pregnant or during their pregnancy, which would be more likely to reduce the chance of their child having an imbalance in their brain.
Yeah, that's so good. So good. All right, we are out of time. I could ask you so many more questions. I love the knowledge you bring to just all of us with the brain and getting us to actually think about our brains differently than I think what we have been led to believe. If there's any last minute advice you would give to somebody who might be struggling with some type of mental health challenge, what advice would that be?
First, try to understand your own brain. Usually, if somebody has a mental health challenge of some sort, almost universally at any age, that person is gifted in something, meaning they're usually really good at something. And they that leaves them vulnerable. And so what I would like them to do is first of all realize that. And they might realize that this isn't you're not broken. There's not something wrong with you. If anything, you are exceptional at something. And it's either with your right brain or your left brain typically. And it's something that probably runs in your family. So understand that, and you may know that if it happened at a very young age, you may have not had a chance to really feel that gift. And the gift may just be reading people, just be really empathetic. And again, no one tests you for that or gives you an award for that. But it is an incredible gift. But the more talented you are in something, the more vulnerable you are for a mental health issue. I always looked at that saying from when I was a kid that there's a thin line between genius and insanity. And really, my work has answered that question as to why. Why is that? Why does that make sense? Right. But the thing is that your brain is changeable at any age. And the idea that you can't do anything about it, sometimes when people are so depressed, they can't find the motivation to do exercises or activities or do things that might help them. and the only thing they can do is take a pill to hang on, and that's okay. But I think learning about your own brain and learning about, I have two books. One is Disconnected Kids, which is really speaks to a child for a parent, but also to tell the parent a lot about their own brain and if they have imbalances. And I have checklists. But then I have a book called Autism, the Scientific Truth, which is really more about assessing the adult brain and understanding that it's a preconception program that you can start to look at your own brain and your own body and inflammatory markers and what they all mean and how you can do things to change that in a 10-point program, which would really fit for almost anybody, even if you don't know anything about autism or want to know anything about autism, but you want to know as an adult, how do I assess my own brain and how do I change my own brain? That book is a really good place to start. And I think you need to, I think we all should be just like in the old days when computers first came out, they had DOS language. And the average person had no idea how to work with a computer. You had to hire somebody to come in and you had to have them work with it. And that was where it seemed. And I look at that like most people think of their body and their brain like they don't know enough. It's this foreign language that they don't know enough about it and they need to use a doctor. I think we, just like we now fix our own iPhones or know how to troubleshoot our own computers, and we don't need a computer expert to come into our house. I'd like to believe that somewhere down the road, that's how we'll feel about our brain. That we know enough about our brain that we can do things on our own to be our own doctor of our own brain, and we can do things to balance our brain, which would be, I think, the single most important thing we can do, not only for our mental health, but even for our physical health.
So good. I really appreciate all your knowledge and everything you shared. Thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. And then if you can share with everyone where they can connect with you.
Yeah, drrobertmelillo.com is my website. We have a lot of information on there. I do have courses that people can access on there, professionals. My books, everything is on there. I also have a big Instagram, Dr. Robert Melillo, and Facebook. And all my books are on Amazon available. I have 8 best-selling books. And we have a lot of research. Everything that I have said is also something that we've published extensive research on. And they're almost all open access. You can go to Google Scholar or PubMed and you can put all my name, and I have over 100 publications there that you can read any of those at any time. And then my daughter and I do a podcast called The Right Brain, WRITE, Right Brain Podcast, which really talks about the unique challenges mentally to the really creative world, the right brain dominant people. She's a singer songwriter in Nashville, and we go down to Nashville every month and we record a bunch, and we speak to some of the most talented people, up and coming young artists or actors or comedians or entrepreneurs. And it's a pretty interesting podcast, I think.
Oh, that's so great. We will have to check it out. We'll put all the information in the show notes. And thank you again for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Okay, my pleasure. It's always great.